Hey, thanks for joining us today. My name is Jen Warren, and I am a fire risk reduction specialist with the Oregon State Fire Marshal. I serve in Northwest Oregon, so some of you may have run into me up here. I'll hand it over to Christy.
Good afternoon. I'm Christy Shaw. I'm the National Fire Plan Coordinator for the Department of Forestry, and I'm really glad to be here and participate and meet all of you guys.
All right, Allison, next slide. So we're here to talk about community wildfire protection plans, and one of the grounding documents that helps or put those in place was really the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003. That law really put this opportunity out there to try to offer broad flexibility for communities to do wildfire planning to help reduce their risk. And also opened our door for opportunities to communicate their priorities and their concerns to the federal government. So it also funded grant programs to improve commercial value of biomass and protection efforts for watersheds and forest health and a handful of other really important things. Next slide. So what's the purpose of a community wildfire protection plan, a CWPP? They serve to identify and prioritize areas for fuel reduction on federal and non-federal ownerships. It opens the door for grant opportunities, and that's often kind of the impetus for communities to take advantage of these planning processes or this planning process. Grant programs like the Western State Fire Managers, Community Assistance through National Fire Plan, and the current Community Wildfire Defense grants are tied to community wildfire protection plans. So having one that is in place and current can open the door to those grant funding opportunities. Next slide. In a community wildfire protection plan, they're in the grounding documents for them. They really direct the federal agencies to consider the community priorities and fuel reduction. So in that way, they serve as a vehicle for communities to be able to communicate, to collaborate with their federal partners cross boundary. So identifying risks that they have in their community and how those are tied to what's going on federal grounds, and helping to kind of build that cross boundary collaboration, pardon me. Community wildfire protection plans can address response and mitigation needs, preparedness. They are required to address structure protection. And in more modern CWPPs, some communities have opted to include more risks because of their broad flexibility. Some communities have taken this as an opportunity to address concerns around climate change, smoke management, which has become more and more concerning to communities, and then also underserved populations in their community. Go ahead, Allison. So included in the CWPP, the projects that are included in the CWPP are decided by the community. Like I said, they can include response activities or response needs. So if a community identifies a prioritized need for more support in terms of response in various ways, those pieces can be included in the CWPP. Hazard mitigation on landscapes and also around homes, addressing the community and trying to encourage their preparedness for wildfire, and then also structure protection. So the three things that are required for a CWPP are that they're collaboratively developed, that they prioritize field treatment, and that they make recommendations to the community on how they can reduce their structural ignitability. Next slide. Collaboration, like I said, is one of the key elements there, and only 3 organizations are really, or 3 government agencies are really required to be involved in the development of a CWPP. That includes the local government, the county or city that is relevant to the CWPP, the local fire department or fire departments if it is cross-jurisdictional, and the state forestry agency, which in our state is obviously the Oregon Department of Forestry. But so while those 3 organizations are required to participate and to ultimately agree to what is included in the CWPP, they encourage broad participation from all kinds of organizations. So forest collaboratives, county governments, watershed councils, non-governmental organizations, so nonprofits, recreation communities, tourism boards, you name it. Anybody that really has a stake in and a concern or a tie to the community can and should provide input into the development of a CWPP. Next slide. I'll hand it over to Christy.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk mostly about like what is out there to help anybody who is working to develop a CWPP. And there are lots of templates, lots of tools. One of the main tools that we suggest from the Department of Forestry is the Oregon Explorer. And so if you'll follow that link. So Oregon Explorer, basically it's a CWPP planning tool. It allows you to develop wildfire risk maps and reference reports that are specific to an area that you choose. So you can choose it by county. You can also choose it by an area that you draw on the map yourself. So if you're doing it at a community level or a city level or anything like that, you can actually decide where that boundary is so that you can have specific reports built and maps built just for your area. So this is all based off of the qualitative wildfire risk analysis data, and also then incorporates lots of other data sets that help identify what type of wildfire risks there might be associated with it. And so if you'll click next slide. This is an example for Douglas County, just the first part of the advanced reports that actually kind of give you an introduction, tells you the size of the county, some of those basic details. And if you are to follow through on those advanced reports, they're like 30 pages long and provide you kind of every analysis that you might be interested. We are in the process right now, based off of an update for the qualitative wildfire risk analysis data that's supposed to be released in June, to take that data and incorporate actually some additional data into updating the Oregon Explorer tool that will make it more user-friendly, provide more information. And some of the information that we're going to be providing into there is actual CWPP boundaries for the state of Oregon, so that you can kind of know what the status of each of them are. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Don't click there. So then some guides and framework to help provide templates, if you'll select that one, Allison. So while you look at this, and the date for this is from 2004, which is actually right after the Healthy Forest Restoration Act came out, there's been no changes to what the expectation from the federal government is to what is included in a CWPP, and no changes to the actual legislation. So these templates are still very valid. The nice thing about this template, the framework one and the next one that we'll see, is that they really provide for uniqueness based on the community desires and what's expected in there. Jen referenced that there were some of the grants that are related and must be kind of uniquely identified within the CWPP. In the past, plans were more vague. Now we're starting to see the necessity to make them actually specific. Instead of saying, mitigate wildfire risks in such and such community, we're seeing where we really need to have it say, what the actual action is, whether it's improve ingress, egress, along a specific road or something like that. We're needing to see more specificity so that we can actually, when it's called out related to those grant applications, someone can actually see that it is tied, it is an identified need within the community. Next slide. Okay, so again, this is one that was developed early on, but I really think that it provides a really good framework if you're building and developing a CWPP, especially if you're developing one from scratch, or really doing an in-depth revision to an existing one. It identifies those three core pieces for a CWPP, which is collaboration. I often tell people that one of the unique pieces for a CWPP is that it brings the federal side to the table. This is one of the few pieces of legislation that actually provides direction to the federal partners like the BLM and the Forest Service to work with communities and develop mitigation strategies and fuel reduction projects on federal land that hopefully corresponds and collaborates with the work that's being done on the private ground. And that's part of that prioritized fuel reduction, as well as like the look at the treatment of structure ignitability. So what can we do to improve survivability of homes and reduce risk to those homeowners? Next slide, please. Some of the tools that we have seen that are actually coming around too, that will make it so that it has the ability to be more interactive with the public through the development stage. And then even once it's been developed, what's out there. Esri, which is a GIS-based platform, has developed an actual, what they call their CWPP hub. And so they actually provided templates for the kind of the ease of people who are working with them. And so this is actually the template for the CWPP. You can work off of it, filling in the different pieces that are in there. And it actually gives you a breakdown so that you can, it tells you what you might include. So it actually is sort of that framework that we saw in the other two documents, but more at a level that's a web-based platform that allows easy access for anybody in the community that has access to the internet. And it provides a lot of visual pieces and components that as you kind of work through developing each of them. So this is the CWPP platform, allows for mapping and things like that. The next one is an actual example for Napa County. You can see that they've incorporated all of the different components in there, including CWPP, they have Firewise, they have their forest action plan. It has a lot of maps, and it actually allows them to incorporate some of the specificity within the county. So if you have a larger county-based one, but you also have some smaller kind of micro sets within the county, you can actually use these to identify them as well if you want to incorporate them all. And then the next one is a story map. So this is basically another tool to engage the community and actually provide information to them. This is the city of Corona, and it's a CWPP just for them. You can see the map where it identifies the boundary of the area that they're working in, and kind of gives all of the information as far as what they did through the process, but then also for the planning process, but also what elements are considered as they kind of start to implement some of those strategies that they're identified in the CWPP. Nope. This is the organics. We don't need to look at this one again, Allison. So then if you want to click on dashboards, Allison. Thank you. This is a dashboard. So based off of using as they went through the CWPP hub for Napa County, they actually started including into a GIS structure all of the mitigation work that they were doing. And you can see that this is just a dashboard that identifies the kind of the different entities that are doing mitigation work and how it plays into the CWPP goals and objectives in there. And it kind of relates it by the entity that does it. And so it's just kind of a visual reference of, are we doing what we need to do? Are we identifying the right pieces? And are we actually creating fuel breaks and things like that through the work we're doing? Thank you, Allison.
Hold on just a minute, my presenters. Hold on just a minute. I accidentally closed it. Give me just a second, folks. Sorry about that.
No worries.
Almost had it. All the screen switching.
I appreciate it. So one of the really nice things as we've kind of talked through some of the older framework documents that we have, but then also looking at some of these new technology versions, is it really makes it more accessible to everyone in the public if you start to implement some of the pieces. And you can do the combination of the two. But I think that having some of the GIS platforms and the story maps and things like that really does allow it to be accessible by everybody in the public. It does create a need for some unique skill sets, but I do think that in today's day and age, a lot of those skill sets are available at the county level. They're also available through some of the nonprofits that are involved, and so it actually encourages engagement for it.
almost there. Stand by.
No worries.
And I might actually, and for folks that don't know, CWPPs used to be part of my day job as well before I jumped full force into public affairs. And so maybe you ladies can talk a little bit about, right, like, I mean, you guys have really talked about collaboration, about some of the great planning and helping folks really understand wildfire risk. Could you maybe talk a little bit more about how it helps build the bridge between communities and our federal partners in the land management there?
I think that is one of the bridge building, team building is one of the biggest components, and that's what makes a CWPP unique, because you can't build a CWPP without your federal partner at the table. And so what I have seen, like we have forest collaboratives that do similar things, but it just is another extension of that relationship building, which I've had several communities express to me. They say, well, we're doing a lot on our side of the fence. Like, what do we need to do to get our neighbor across the fence to do work too? This is a great opportunity if you're participating in the CWPP meetings and actually being a voice for your community, even if it's a county-wide one, being that voice at the smaller community level that helps to identify where those priority projects are, because our federal partners, they're managing millions of acres. So they are not necessarily aware of every acre that could actually provide a huge benefit if it does get treatment onto it.
And I'd say that kind of tagging on to that, the groups that are built out of a CWPP, that stakeholder group, that collaboration that they've developed can provide all kinds of benefits to the community if you keep those groups going. And so I think one of the side benefits, the biggest and almost one of the most important side benefits of this, is that there's communication amongst all the people that have a role and a stake in wildfire risk in the community. But it takes a level of work, and it's important to try to maintain that communication and that momentum. And we'll talk a little bit about that in a little bit too. All right.
I saw in the chat, there was a question as to whether the slides would be available. I think Allison will be providing a link for those, if I remember correctly from my last one, but definitely I think we're willing to share with them.
I think this is you, Christy.
Okay. I couldn't remember where we were at exactly. So in terms of like developing a plan, I think the starting point is you define the coverage or the area that you're going to work in. So whether it's a community level one that's like maybe a drainage or a city, whatever that might be, figure out where that is and where those boundaries are, and then look around, not just within those boundaries, but also look around outside, like the adjacency piece. And then you're going to want to take and figure out kind of who should be involved, like who should really be participating.
You loser.
So I think maybe Christy may have frozen. Jen, so if you want to pick up where she's at,
All right.
and keep going.
So we've talked about this a few times, but engaging those, establishing that community base map, developing that community risk assessment that addresses your fuel hazards, the risk of wildfire, homes, businesses, infrastructure at risk, and even other community values. And that can include your local historical or cultural history values, things that you would be concerned about losing if a wildfire were to affect your community. And then taking that and establishing some priorities about what hazards are going to be addressed and how they will be addressed. And from that, developing an action plan and assessment strategy so that you can follow up and check and see where you are, and which includes some of that communication that I was talking about before, making sure that you have that communication amongst the group and you're following up routinely, making sure that you're making progress towards your action plan and your goals, and identifying new goals that may arise as things change. A lot of plans are revised about every 5 years. Some of them have kind of a 10-year cycle. Some of them haven't been revised in a long time and could be. And things change over those years. So making sure that you're staying on top or, in touch of what should be changed and what should be adapted for the next revision, and identifying those so that which can make the next revision a lot easier. And then finalizing the plan. So making sure that you have those three key groups, the State Forestry Agency, the fire department, and the local governments in agreement on the plan, and taking that and starting to get things going. Looks like we have Christy back, so I'll hand it back to her.
I apologize. All of a sudden I was just gone. So I think you covered everything in this one, at least from what I saw. So next slide. So in 2020, the Communities at Risk report, that is again one that uses some of that quantitative wildfire risk assessment, what we reference as the QWRA. It also includes some of the Silvas data, which is used for WUI identification, and then also some of the kind of fire behavior, fire analysis, and fire history into there that identified communities across Oregon that were at an increased risk of wildfire danger, which obviously impacts those communities differently than some of the other ones. And so those ones are identified. Oftentimes, again, our federal grants ask for how you identified an area that your application is related to for mitigation work. Why is this area more important than another area, say? Next slide. This is also the Forest Action Plan, which also relates to both CWPPs and that Community at Risk report. And basically, it's just a plan for Oregon that allows us to identify, like, what are the goals? And so some of the goals are the one it's shown here is, restoration of wildfire back into communities. And so it's using prescribed fire to kind of reduce the risk of fire within communities, so controlling it. But these are there. Oftentimes, again, our mitigation grants ask us to tie directly back to something that is identified in this Forest Action Plan. And it's I almost look at it like a CWPP for the entire state. So it's looking at things it's a broader level, and that it doesn't specifically say for this community, but it gives us goals that we should be looking at for communities across Oregon. Next slide, please.
So a couple kind of foundational pieces that I think are helpful in developing a CWPP. One big program, one framework that is a national framework is the National Wildland Fire Cohesive Strategy. And this graphic here kind of represents what that is. It stands on kind of three legs of a three-legged stool, building resilient landscapes, ensuring safe and effective wildfire response, and then creating fire adapted communities, which is hoping that Americans and American communities are ready to live with wildfire. The cohesive strategy is really built and founded and grounded in science, which is why it's in the middle of that there. Next, Allison. So that fire adapted communities leg of that three-legged stool, there's another framework, national framework that's out there. It's just the Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network. And this wheel graphic that's on this screen slide here kind of shows a lot of the pieces that can go into that building a truly fire adapted community. And as you can see, there are a lot of pieces that can play into that. A lot like CWPPs, fire adapted communities should scale to the actual needs of that community. So in some places, some of these pieces may be more relevant and have a little bit more weight than others, and others may not be relevant at all. So using the fire adapted communities, it can kind of framework, it can kind of scale, shrink and swell to what's the best benefit to the community. And this organization, Fire Adapted Communities Learning Network, has all kinds of tools and resources, including tools for developing CWPPs. And you can see that CWPPs are in that regulation, policy, and plans section of the FAQ wheel there. So next slide. So in Oregon, our office, the State Fire Marshal, Oregon State Fire Marshal, we are working to develop an initiative called Fire Adapted Oregon. And this is kind of Oregon's implementation of the Fire Adapted Communities program. So myself and the others like me, there are 7 total of us fire risk reduction specialists spread out across the state, across the state, sorry. We work in communities in a variety of counties across the state where we work directly with communities, with the fire service and with the community to help Oregon become better fire adapted. So we're really working on the community side and not in the landscape resiliency piece. Our agency also does work in the wildfire response leg of that three-legged stool, but the program that we're talking about right here is the fire adapted communities fire piece. Next slide. So there are some barriers to creating CWPPs. Sometimes the trick is, there's a huge hurdle in creating the plan. And then sometimes there's capacity challenges to just maintain them at the local level. A lot of times they're developed by contractors or consultants. And once that consultant is gone, it can be challenging for the local community to sustain that work. As folks leave and they retire or they move to other careers, that turnover can create some holes in the momentum. If some of those people were kind of key leadership in that stakeholder group for the CWPP, once their leadership has moved on, sometimes the CWPP stakeholder group kind of fizzles a little bit, which can be challenging to maintain that momentum. CWPPs can be expensive depending on what the community really wants them to be. They don't have to be. They can scale to the needs of the community. But in some cases, they can be expensive if that's kind of the plan that you're looking for and hiring a consultant. If you don't have the right people involved, this can be a challenge because sometimes not all the voices that are necessary that should be at the table and weighing in on the concerns and helping to prioritize those projects. If they're not included, that can create some barriers to making sure that you've done all the things that should be done to have the best payoff for your community. And then if you, on kind of that same leg, if you are limiting the involvement and trying to just get this done quickly, and not including all those voices, you're not really gathering a real good, clear view of what the community needs. So your plan may not be the best reflection of your community's needs on the end. Making sure that you include the community, include your Firewise communities, include your local emergency teams and other groups like that are speaking for your public. Make sure that they're at the table and have an opportunity to weigh in because their voices are really important. It's definitely a collaborative effort. You've heard us say this over and over. That is one of the founding pieces, core pieces of a CWPP, and it is really important. And then just making sure that you have that implementation of the plan and you're taking the time and getting the work done to get that implementation done. Next slide. So CWPPs, we've talked about this a little bit. Healthy Forest Restoration Act allows communities to define your own wildland urban interface. That allows the community, the local government, the local folks to really take into account some of the nuance that is in their community that may not be easily identified from a kind of coarse scale assessment of the wildland urban interface. You can use the statewide communities at risk assessment. There was early support from ODF way back in the early days of the National Fire Plan to develop these plans. And ODF is a big player at the table still and should be. So tying in with your local ODF representatives is important. Some plans after that kind of early development and leadership from ODF have kind of handed off to the counties. So help getting to know who has kind of the ownership of the plan, and if you will, is important, and just to know who to talk to. And then in some cases, the counties have incorporate the CWPP into their natural hazard mitigation plan as a wildfire chapter. There are some funding opportunities potentially. The Community Wildfire Defense Grant did offer funding support for developing or renewing or revising CWPPs, and that will change over the years depending on what that grant continues to look like. And then some, just kind of noting that a lot of the plans, some of the plans that we have in the state have become kind of outdated. They kind of went on the shelf and haven't been updated for a while. So there are opportunities to try to dust those off and tap into some of the funding that is available out in the world right now. Next slide. Christy.
This is just contact information for me. If you have questions, happy to answer them or point you in the right direction of the local staff that's already working, hopefully with counties for developing plans. And then as well, our website that has some additional information and some links to the framework documents that we referenced earlier on the site.
So for our office, there's my contact information there. Like I mentioned, I'm one of 7. So we have a map right there on the screen that you can see that kind of shows our breakout across the state. We are divided up on county lines, so it's pretty easy to recognize who's who. And then there's a link there that will take you to a map that will show you the contact information for each of the 7 of us. Next. We'll open up to questions.
I am going to be kind of our moderator for questions right now for folks. And so we had a couple questions kind of roll in as you ladies were presenting. And so I'll start with those and then we can continue to kind of work down as folks have more questions. So one question was, you know, and I don't know if we might know this number off the top of our head or even a ballpark, but we know how many communities in Oregon actually have an active CWPP.
So every county in Oregon has a CWPP. There's one county that has a little bit of the county not included in an active CWPP. I don't know the exact number, and part of that is just some of them are legacy plans. So they initiated one, maybe things haven't changed, but there are active currently right now. I want to say like 7 counties that are actually working right now to update their plans and revise them. Some counties update very regularly every 5 years. There is no requirement to update one, and so it's really based on the needs. So how is that document being used in the county? It's also being or the community level. Also, sometimes it's they're updating it so that they can apply for funding through either FEMA, our National Fire Plan grant, CWDG, whatever that might be. So sometimes there's no urgency to update one. And sometimes some of those other legacy plans have actually been incorporated into a larger plan at the county level.
Okay, and then we had another question around, I know Jen briefly talked about this, but you know, what funding sources are out there that can support kind of a CWPP development, right? Like if a community doesn't have one and they want to start that, what kind of kickstart money is out there?
I think you're better to answer this one, Christy.
I was going to let you, since I know that the State Fire Marshal has just recently funded a few plans in the state. So there is funding through the State Fire Marshal through some of their grant programs.
And we lost her again.
Technology issues abound today, folks. Sorry about that. So I will, Jen, I may dive in here real quick. So I'm going to put on my former CWPP hat. So I would say right now there's a few sources out there for folks, and I will be clear that none of these require a certain scale to be eligible for these funding sources. So Jen mentioned the new Community Wildfire Defense Grant from the U.S. Forest Service. This is CWDG grants. The first round of those just got approved. And so those got approved and awarded. The application process did take some time, but those are federal grants that are available. Another grant or funding resource that's out there is something called Title III funding. That is a county-based funding source. You do need to check in with your county folk to see if that is funding they have available. And if it's not allocated to a different source. Sometimes Title III funding can be used for search and rescue. It can also be used for things like Firewise, CWPPs, and such. And then what Christy was saying before we lost her for a second, now she's back with us, is Our office has been fortunate enough to be able to give some kind of strategic investments. So Oregon State Fire Marshal was able to give some communities funding to support either the update of a very old CWPP or the creation of their very first one. And so that was something that Jen and her cohorts actually did a really deep dive into what was existing in the state, what gaps were there. And so we're kind of waiting to see if we're eligible for some more funding from the Oregon legislature to continue that program, but we were able to invest some dollars in communities there. So Christy, I may pause there. Jen, I may pause there, see if there's anything I missed on funding sources for you ladies to add.
You got the ones that I know of.
And the only thing and I don't know what's going on, why it just keeps kicking me off. So I apologize because I'm not even touching anything. But is like through the National Fire Plan grants, we can actually fund CWPPs as well. If counties work or communities work with their local ODF office as part of the submission process for grant applications.
Awesome, perfect, thank you.
And I saw in the chat also that Susan put in that DLCD is also funding a few, it sounds like.
Oh, great, wonderful. Okay, and then so another question is, Christy, you talked a little bit about that, all 36 counties in Oregon have some sort of semblance of a CWPP, but are counties required to initiate a CWPP given the increase in wildfire risks and overall cost?
There is no requirement to have a CWPP. And that's one of the pieces is it's all based on the community's desires. So there is no, we don't go around and check and say, do you have a CWPP or not? I do try to encourage our staff to work with the local counties or the local communities especially as I'm looking at some of the ones that are older and in play. And there are some counties that are fairly old, and they basically, when I've reached out to them, they've determined that nothing has really changed. And so the CWPP is in their minds still current. But we don't go through, and there's no requirement on our end to force someone to undertake this project.
Perfect, thank you. And then another question around more examples. So do you ladies know of any examples of CWPPs that are developed at a non-county level, right? Kind of at that different scale for folks to take a look at and access?
Yeah, I can, ODF made a concerted effort in trying to get a CWPP and at least one CWPP to pretty much cover everybody in the state of Oregon. And back in the day, that was kind of at the county level, but prior to that effort, some communities had already kind of taken a dive into them. And so Deschutes County is a really good example. I believe, Allison, I'm gonna look to you, but my number is 7 that Deschutes County has 7 different CWPPs that they maintain. And they've done a really good job of maintaining them over the years and have them on a 5-year cycle. So at any one point in time, they were revising at least one, the way that they're set up currently. And those are broken up a little bit differently, more on community scale boundaries that they've determined that fit for their community, for the county, that they can identify differences between like the Greater Sisters area or other parts of Eastern Deschutes County or something like that, that fits better for their county. But most of the counties in Oregon have one per county. Outside of Deschutes County, and some work in Southwest.
And there's actually there's several that are actually community based, like the Bly has their own CWPP, and so I can provide you some examples of those documents. They are not linked on our website because we've done mostly just the county ones linked there. But there are, and Deschutes County is actually going to go and revert back to one in the county. But they're still, and so this is what I only bring this up in that they're still going to identify those 7 as basically sub chapters within their CWPP. So even if you feel really strongly that there's some uniqueness about a specific area, there can still be sub chapters within the county one and part of the reason for Deschutes County is so that they don't have to duplicate the effort of some of the things that actually are county-wide pieces and components of the CWPP. They can actually do it more as only have to work and update those. And so it's a cost cutting or efficiency standpoint by then focusing all of their effort on those different chapters of each of them. Douglas County in 2017, I think it was, reverted to a similar way and incorporating their kind of ones that were broken up by the county into one, but still maintaining that independence of each of those areas. But there are, Umatilla County has one actually that crosses into Washington for the Mill Creek. So that's, and as Jen mentioned, in Southern Oregon, Jackson County and Josephine County actually have created theirs together as the Rogue Valley Integrated Plan. But they also, the city of Ashland is going to be developing or actually revising their existing one. So there are some out there where they are really truly based at the community level, but a lot of those have become legacy plans and incorporated into the countywide plan.
Okay, great, thank you. So then we had a question touching on the funding piece again. Do U.S. Forest Service grants require a community to be adjacent to the national forest boundaries?
And I guess I would need a little bit of clarity in terms of the grants that are related to CWPP development, or are we talking specifically about fuel reduction mitigation grants that are funded through Region 6?
And Pam, if you're still with us, I believe you can unmute if you'd like to clarify and give us a little bit more so we can do our best to answer your question.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, my question we're just getting started in the little valley that I live in, and we don't have we're adjacent to Starker and OSU, but not to the Siuslaw. So I was looking at mitigation. I was also looking at possibly becoming a Firewise community, and I just wondered if that was even a grant we should look at, or it was not something that would work for us because of our location.
So grants that are through national fire plans, so whether it's community assistance or the WUI grants to the Western State fire managers, those ones do require adjacency or benefit to federal ground. So
Okay.
benefit to is somewhat subject, but in terms of, and those are mitigation grants. The community wildfire defense grants, I don't believe that there's any requirement that you have adjacency to it. Those are a little bit broader in scope and really focus on communities themselves rather than the benefits to federal ground.
And is community sort of an overall word for a bunch of people living in the woods? As opposed to being like the city of Corvallis or the city of Adair?
So community is just kind of a broad term for any boundary that you would, that makes sense to include into a plan for whatever reason that you determine it should be used.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I will say, Pam, and for any of our grant writers on the line, a lot of times those grants, if they are asking you to prove adjacency, it's very clear in the instructions too. They like, has to be X and such amount of distance adjacent or things like that. And so I would also say I have found that community can be whatever you argue it to be. So, whether it's one neighborhood, a road, a city, whatever it may be, if you really get your persuasive hat on, you can make it be whatever you want it to be in your grant application. So then we had a question around how would a CWPP having a CWPP impact access federal and state funds after wildfire has impacted or hit a community?
So in my mind, the CWPP is not as relevant in this. I think one thing that is not often included in CWPPs is the recovery piece. And that's a piece that could be, because of their broad flexibility, it can. And if your community thinks that's important, which it is, which we know after the 2020 fires for sure, including some planning around recovery and tying into folks who are involved in recovery processes, and including that in your CWPP could be important. the recovery part after a wildfire disaster really ends up falling to FEMA and others. And that's not a program that I'm as familiar with, having not worked for FEMA or emergency management. But typically FEMA is the one that comes in with the funding and support. And they have grants and funding that can go directly to counties when they have disaster declarations that can help support kind of on the back end for pre-planning for the next potential disaster. But you know, including the recovery folks when you're doing CWPP planning is like I said, it's not required, but it would be a really good added benefit for your plans as you're revising them.
And I would maybe echo that right now, the way both recovery and then kind of preparedness dollars are set up, they're kind of two separate buckets, at least in the FEMA game. But having a CWPP does kind of help you prioritize those areas. When heaven forbid it happens and you get what's called an FMAG, which is essentially it helps reimburse for firefighting costs and it's a declared disaster. FEMA has gotten to the point where they know, right? So if you were, heaven forbid, have impacts bad enough to actually have a declared disaster, you get funding through the hazard mitigation program. So it's the HMGP, the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. Alphabet soup, folks, I'm so sorry, but those are not dollars to help reimburse firefighting costs, but those are actually dollars to come in and help with hazard mitigation. And so if you have a CWPP, it could just help your community kind of make sense of the dollars that are coming your way, maybe where you can prioritize some of those efforts, focus some of those efforts. Those funds cannot be used for recovery specifically, but right, if you have other folks in the community that want to know what they can do, where they want to do work, having one doesn't necessarily impact your eligibility for recovery funds, but it may help you if all of a sudden you find yourself with a bunch of money without a plan, because that's sometimes a grant writer's worst nightmare, is a whole bunch of money that they don't have a plan for. So that's kind of how that interacts with the recovery space. And we'll maybe pause there. We are caught up on questions in the chat, but we have about 10 more minutes together. So I want to make sure that if there's any other questions, folks can either unmute or pop it into the chat and we can do our best to answer them. Yeah, Bernadette, please.
I'm just wondering what happens to communities where they're not going to have a fire that is covered by FEMA, and also recognition that, I'm just a net, but I've been attending a lot of FEMA stuff. Their goal is to make everybody else resilient because they don't have the money to deal with all the climate change disasters coming our way. So reliance upon FEMA isn't a good idea, even if you have a national disaster declared, and then a lot of people won't make it to that level while they're still dealing with it. So does what you do also have a section that sort of encourages people to make sure that their CWPP has a plan for recovery so that it's in their mind? Is that part of what you put into how to create a CWPP? And that's my first question. And the second one is about Multnomah County, where I live. It's real easy to see the need for these kinds of plans in a lot of rural wooded areas. My concern is about Forest Park and how close it is to the energy infrastructure with all those tanks, the tank farms, and what that would mean for the rest of the state if we had that kind of fire, which would also take out OHSU as a major hospital. And so a lot of this, I'm not sure how that would work in with a more rural, urban area like Portland. So those are my two questions. Thank you.
So I can help field the Multnomah County piece for sure, because Multnomah County is a county that I serve. And Multnomah County is one of the ones that is in the process of updating their CWPP right now. And I'm serving on the stakeholder group in that process. And I think one of the really great things about the Multnomah County plan is that it incorporates some of these things that might, like smoke impacts and like climate change and social vulnerability, that aren't required, but that are kind of related to this, to, you know, wildfire mitigation. In the old way, it was kind of all about like getting prepared and reducing your risk. And now we kind of understand it a little bit better as being adapted, being ready to live with wildfire. Wildfire is going to be here whether we want it to or not, but we need to be prepared to live with it. And so making sure that, you know, we have our homes prepared, our infrastructure prepared, our people prepared, that everybody understands what they need to do if a wildfire were to impact them. I can tell you that Forest Park is definitely a place of concern in the county, that folks in the county have long identified that as one of the places of high wildfire risk, for a lot of the reasons that you mentioned. There are a number of active Firewise groups around the Forest Park area that are doing really incredible leadership work, I think, in terms of community-led wildfire risk reduction in an urban area, in a place that on the outside might not scream out, you know, a terrible wildfire place when you think about like versus Central Oregon that has fire on a routine basis. So I think there are great pieces of work going on in Multnomah County, and with that Forest Park side, and then also out in the East County side too, around Corbett. There are there are some groups out there that are leading the charge and trying to get that area better fire adapted. And then I apologize, but I've kind of lost your first question.
It was just about communities that aren't necessarily going to be covered by FEMA, and making sure that they have a plan for that, and that resilience and a restoration afterwards is whether or not that's going to be part of how we look at CWPPs, given the increase in fire. There's no longer a fire season. It could be any time, for example. From where you guys live, are you trying to stress that people need to have that recovery in as a part of CWPP?
I think that's something we definitely want people to include. CWPP is a really incredible tool, but it's a tool. It's not, and part of what makes it an incredible tool is that it's broadly flexible. It scales to the community and what the community's concerns are, what the community's priorities are, and encourages that communication between stakeholders. So I tell people I'm a CWPP fan. Like, I think that they have, because they have that potential to meet the community where they are and do what they need it to do. It's a tool for communication. It's a tool for kind of encouraging action. And ultimately, in the big scale of things, we're looking at trying to adapt people in the United States to a different wildfire reality. Like you said, you know, we have wildfire year now. It's there all the time. We just had fires last weekend with high heat and wind in May. And like, when has this happened in Northwest Oregon in the past? I mean, this is just increasing. This is something that we are living with. We are living in a period of change. And a CWPP is a tool to help plan for how we're going to adapt to that new wildfire reality. And so I would encourage communities to include things like recovery and in addition to the mitigation piece, the front end and the back end of what's going to happen related to wildfire. So right on what you're saying.
I do have one thing I want to add for people who are looking for grants and doing planning and policy. I would urge you to take a look at the city of Mill Valley. One of the things they managed to do was to get Google to help them map their roads because they're heavily forested. And they actually have done a citywide fire drill to plan how to make sure they get people out of the woods and into basically they're blocked in. Their fire break is the ocean. And so how to get to the freeway, where are the places people in the flats can move over to allow people to come down the hill. And if you're looking for grant money, being able to figure out how to evacuate your community is a place to look. And maybe with the use of all of this new technology that you wouldn't otherwise think of, take a look at Mill Valley. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bernadette, for all your questions. And I would maybe just kind of echo some of Jen's comments. The beautiful thing about CWPPs is they're only as good as the folks that participate. So, right, like if you're really feeling like you want to highlight, climate adaptation, recovery, those pieces, right? Like get it to somebody on the stakeholder group or go to the meetings and say, hey, right, is this part of this group? This is where I live. I'm in your county and these are important to me. Because at the end of the day, making sure the entire community is involved is super important. So for my planners that are on the line too, one of the best recommendations I ever got from one of my mentors when I started taking on CWPP work was hold them like Saturday mornings in the evening and feed people, because people will show up, right? Like if you feed folks, even if you say something like they don't believe in wildfire risk, whatever it may be, right? Like if you're talking about wildfire, they will never put down a free meal. They will at least sit, you have them for 15 minutes before they leave. So feed people and host them in non-traditional hours. Because then a lot of folks can actually make those meetings and engage on kind of the critical components that Bernadette brought up for communities. So with that, folks, we only have 2 minutes left. And so just to make sure that I'm respectful of your lunch hour, I want to thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to quickly share my screen on, we have 4 more webinars coming up. Oregon State Fire Marshal's Office has been hosting these along with our amazing partners like Oregon Department of Forestry. So we have 2 more this month, and then we have 2 more in June. And so we would love for you to stop by, spend some more time with us, and attend any of these that make sense. We are recording these and posting them on the web for folks if for whatever chance you're not able to make them. And then when we can, we're also posting a PDF of the slides if you want to refer back to them. So with that, folks, like I said, I really appreciate you all being here. And thank you for spending your lunch hour with us. Thank you for the great questions. And I think with that, we are going to let you go. So thank you so much. Have a great rest of your Tuesday.